We are back on the Zero Hour. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and my next guest recently wrote an op-ed for the New York Times, which pointed out, among other things, that people who work on behalf of working people most of the time spend most of their time, quote, making connections and hoping the sparks they light will catch and burn. Well, we certainly feel the same way. And I wanted to talk to her about it because she really does a great overview of some of the movements that arose in the past year. And I wanted to talk to her about what might happen in the next year as well. Sarah Jaffe is the author of the book Necessary Trouble, Americans in Revolt. She is a Nation Institute Fellow and an independent journalist covering a lot of the stuff we cover on this show as well. And she's the co-host of the Belabored podcast put out by Dissent Magazine. She's been on the program before. We're delighted to have her back. So Sarah Jaffe, welcome back.
Thank you for having me back.
It's a pleasure. And it was a pleasure reading this piece, starting with the headline. As I was saying before we went on the air, don't always like the headlines editors give us, but the exhilaration of revolt, a phrase from your piece. Is revolt exhilarating?
You know, revolt is kind of my brand. I just realized after writing that piece and after they put the headline on there that it's also in the subtitle of my book. So I guess here we are. But, you know, I think the thing is that I wrote that line in talking about the Gilets jaunes, the French protests that have been going on for the last month. And what I see in France is sort of the same thing that we saw in the US during Occupy or in the height of the movement for Black Lives, is that once people start to go out into the streets and to make demands, it's hard to put that back in the bottle, even if it eventually slows down, it changes. It doesn't quite go away. That feeling, once you've had it, is really hard to subdue. And so I want to capture that.
And that feeling is, I'm trying to think of the right word for it and avoid cliche, but I may fail. It's a feeling to me of empowerment. It's a feeling that I have more freedom, more autonomy, more agency than I ever realized. But I have it when I come together, I think preferably in real space, not online. With like-minded people for a common purpose that is higher than any one individual among us. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I think one of the things that we saw in France, that we saw in most of the movements of the last, decade, about a decade that's been since the financial crisis, is that you get people moving from sort of complaining on the internet to actually getting together in public space to talk, but also to act, to really raise some hell, which can be a lot of fun, it turns out. And the thing is that we, in the last several decades, have really been denied a lot of the former spaces that people used to have to be political and public together. So with the decline of things like labor unions, where people used to have a space where they would go and talk to their colleagues, their coworkers about the different things that were going on in their lives and find ways to act on them. With the decline of institutions like that, people are really isolated, they're really demoralized, they're really alienated. And so the feeling that you get when you come back together is a thing that, it's a really human feeling to want to be with people, to want to sort of have those moments of collective joy, as Barbara Ehrenreich wrote about in her book, Dancing in the Streets. But in particular, when we're talking about politics and we're talking about sort of rebellion and the joy of just, when you look at France, there's this sort of gleeful, just, sticking a middle finger up at President Macron, who then, in his utter cluelessness, gives his speech conceding to some of their demands from a gilded room, like gold desk in the palace. And some of the graffiti has been just great about things like, there's one that I love that says, the planet is burning, why isn't the presidential palace? And my French is not great, so I'm relying on somebody else's translation, but I'm pretty sure that's what it says. And, when you look at this guy sitting in this golden palace, and then you look at these people bundled up at intersections, protesting this climate, this supposed climate policy, this carbon tax, this gas tax on the things that they need to get to work, because there's, by the way, no public transportation, and the toll booths that they're protesting at are all privatized and cost an arm and a leg in order for them to get to work. And then they're told, we're going to raise your taxes while this jerk continues to sit in a gilded room. The feeling of finally just getting out in the streets and saying no is overwhelming.
Saying no, and maybe some other words, some of which begin with the French equivalent of F or whatever. But absolutely, and Macron in particular, as a leader, is obviously at the end it was down to Macron or Marine Le Pen, the proto-fascist. And of course, it was good that she didn't get elected. But he seems to have an imperial mindset, as well as being absolutely a creature of the global financial elite. So in a way, he's the perfect foil for a movement like this. But one of the things I wanted to talk to you about, Sarah, is that I think a lot of people are misreading the Gilets jaunes movement as being somehow, sure, it has elements of left and right, that I think ultimately could prove to be a good thing. But people are saying, well, it's it's a revolt against taxes. Well, not in the sense that we think about it in this country. To me, it's a revolt against wealth extraction from the top directed against the bottom. And so tax in this case means something very different, that when you have all the profiteering of the Macron allies basically in the elite, and then you decide, well, we're going to address the problems that has created for the planet by punishing lower income people. It reminds me, frankly, of the English Rebellion of 1381 against taxation, but in this case because the peasant and working class was being asked to finance the wars and other extravagances of the elites. So to me, anti-tax gets it all wrong. To me, it's anti-elite.
Well, and particularly, so this is kind of the last straw for a lot of these people. When you look at what's happening in France, right? You see that Macron pushed through a giant tax cut on the rich, right? Then he has reformed, quote unquote, big air quotes around reform, right? What they've done is change France's famously worker-friendly work week, right? The labor laws that France had one of the shortest work weeks in Western Europe, which is certainly shorter than what we work in this country. And so the labor law reform means that people are working more hours, and that they've just seen Macron's rich buddies get a big tax cut. And now they're being told that you are going to have to pay more taxes in order to get to work, which you're already working more now. And you are paying more of your share of this. And people aren't stupid, right? They know that climate change is a problem. They also know who's causing it. And it's not the working class person who has to live in the suburbs because they can't afford to live in Paris, but then has to drive to the city to get to work every day. And that's who these protests really are. And the thing about that, too, is that, again, what we saw in Occupy, what we saw in the protests in Europe and Greece and in Spain against austerity in the first round of, what we now call the Eurozone crisis, is that you had a lot of people who were not identified with any particular political party. They were mad, they were disenfranchised, they had been really badly served by the move towards the center, the move towards neoliberalism of the things that had been the traditionally socialist parties, right? So Macron was in the government of the previous prime minister, or the previous president of France, who was from the PS, the Socialist Party. Theoretically a socialist party. It's not any more socialist than, Hillary Clinton is socialist.
Right.
But so Macron managed to sort of rebrand himself coming out of that party, forming a new thing that's sort of a party, but really it's just the cult of Macron. And selling this all really hard, and the international media, the US media ate this guy up, right? The savior of Europe and all this garbage. Yeah, look at that now.
Right. How's that working out for you? I believe is the expression.
He really is a creature of the neoliberal center.
Right.
And he really had no idea what he was doing. he gets into office and immediately thinks that the way to stave off fascism is to beat up on working people and give his rich buddies a tax break, which plays right into the hands of Marine Le Pen, who would love to get to play the pro-worker populist. The interesting thing that's been happening in France since these protests started, though, is that so Le Pen and also Jean-Luc Mélenchon, whose party La France Insoumise, and I apologize for my French accent, it's terrible. The left-wing party has also been in the streets and been supporting the protests. And so you had this sort of, on the one hand, this vying for who was going to control this narrative. But then the other thing that Le Pen's National Front promises is law and order. And so at some point, she has to choose whether she's going to support the protesters or is going to offer the law and order response. And so that puts the far right in a difficult place with these protests that the left is hopefully able to capitalize on. But the real thing that you hear when you listen to, when you read interviews with people who are protesting, is that they are not aligned with any of these political parties. You have people who voted for Macron and are really disappointed in him. You have people who didn't vote. You have people who voted for Le Pen. You have people who voted for Mélenchon. You have people who voted for one of the various other smaller French parties. And what it is it's a collective sort of, again, like a big screw you to the top, right? There's nothing that says, to paraphrase my friend George Chicorella-Mar, nothing says enough like a car set on fire and dumped in a toll booth, a privatized toll booth.
Right. Oh, no, I think that's exactly right. And I think that, the exhilaration in part comes from the fact that they're not waiting to be led by a political party or a leading political figure. And it seems to me, I was in France last year, I talked to folks there. It seems to me that this sort of organized party left, I mean, Mélenchon is trying to fill a void there, but the political electoral left is really, it's not even going to be a player in this year's European Parliament elections in France, I don't think. They don't seem to be fielding a meaningful ticket. So I think this is really a response. For some reason, number one, the Gilets jaunes, the Yellow Vest movement, reminds me a lot of Occupy in that sense.
Yeah, there's a lot of that tendency there, right? And there was a lot of that in Occupy.
Yeah, and they also, in that sense of disaffection, that sense of spontaneity, that sense of self-organization, it also strikes me as being like Occupy in that the media has chosen to take any example of extreme behavior, which if you get large groups of people, there will always be extreme behavior, whether it's in the city or anywhere else. And they have taken it and blown it out of proportion to discredit the movement. And Macron, even after granting them some concessions 5 weeks into the process, I don't know if you saw Macron's or read about Macron's New Year's Eve message, but he just lashed out at them in a fury.
He's just sinking like a stone in popularity, and basically kind of has been since he was elected. But the thing that and the reason that I sort of ended my piece with them when I was writing about this, I mentioned the Extinction Rebellion protests in the UK. And the thing that I've been thinking about a lot lately, right, is, we have, according to very reputable middle-of-the-road scientists, about 11 years left to turn things around before we make the planet completely just uninhabitable for anybody who looks vaguely like us. And so I think to tell ourselves that that's going to happen nicely and orderly and by just electing a few more nice people to Parliament, Congress, the European Parliament, et cetera, without some serious upheaval, I think we're kidding ourselves. It's just really to say that nothing is going to be set on fire, nothing is going to be broken, nothing is going to result in serious disruption of life in major cities or anywhere else for that matter. It's impossible. And what's more, it just, to think that that's how things work, like erases the entirety of human history. And so, I've been thinking a lot about this piece that Chris Hayes wrote a few years ago for The Nation, talking about the fact that the only comparable loss of capital by the ruling class in history to what needs to happen in order to halt climate change, the amount of wealth that is already sort of pre-assumed to exist and be owned by a tiny handful of rich jerks, is the abolition of slavery.
Right.
And that took a war. And so I'm not saying we're going to have to go to war to stop climate change, because good Lord, like, this is a human extinction level crisis, or we should, hopefully people will take it seriously. But to understand the resistance that is going to be put up to this being solved on anything like the level it needs to be, we need to look at what's happening in France and say, like, we're going to see more of this, whether we like it or not.
So and once again, we're talking with Sarah Jaffe, author of the book Necessary Trouble and a recent piece in the New York Times. You begin with hope, and I want to talk about hope, but Sarah, forgive me, I just need to take a brief rant on the subject of the planet. Number one, Green New Deal, to me, not only imperative, but much too modest a framing, in my point of view. Second World War is too modest a framing. We're talking about planetary war. We're talking about a war for planetary survival. And the response of the Democratic, and this is to underscore your point, the response of leading Democrats in the House of Representatives was, well, we can't have the committee that the Sunrise Movement and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez want, because it cuts into our committee authority and the authority of the existing House chairs.
The ability of us to fundraise from oil companies.
Right. So sorry about your planet, but it just doesn't fit with our personal plans, objectives, and egos. And so to me, that's to underscore your point that it may it's unlikely that there's any way we can do it nicely. But I wanted to get to the beginning of your program where you quote Mariam Kaba, the organizer, as saying hope is a discipline, and then you're saying that discipline is what sustains organizers who often grind away unseen for years. I don't want to get personal, but I mean, I'll tell you, I have a personal recipe for hope. When things look grim, and then if you want to include yours, I will. But I call it my Pascal's wager with the future. There may not be a chance to fix things, but what if there is and we don't take it? So let's give it 100%, which, by the way, also gives us meaning in the present moment. That's my formula for hope. Do you have one that you'd be willing to share?
I mean, I think really the formula that I have for hope as I look around at the people who aren't sitting still and who are raising hell all over the place. And, so I start the piece off with the United Teachers of Los Angeles, the union of teachers, which is, barring a last minute deal, going to be on strike next week. I'm thinking about all of the teachers who went on strike in the last year, and particularly to connect us back to the climate crisis, right? The amount of those teachers in places like West Virginia and Oklahoma, which are really states that are dependent for all of their wealth on extractive industries, the way those teachers went up against these industries and said, actually, you all have to pay for the things we need. That was, again, a hint of what we need to see happen. And so, that's when I got the email asking me to write about hope for the end of the year. I did not have a terribly hopeful year on a lot of fronts. But I do look around at this, and I do see that people are fighting, and I also see how quickly things can change, how quickly the conversation we're having can change, and how quickly people's understanding of the world they live in can change. And that is a thing that, I wanted to sort of include in this piece, both the way that long-term organizing sort of goes on, and you have to do that sort of disciplined hope process, right? You have to go with the old phrase, pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. Right. You really just have to do the work and trust that you're doing something worth doing. And at the same time, how a spark, like something that we saw, like what we see in France, can change people's perception of the world that they live in a very short period of time. And so the combination of those two things, the sort of dialectic of those two things, is the thing that keeps me going, of knowing that, like, at any moment something could kick off that I was not expecting, and trying to keep an eye on the places where I think that might break out, and also be flexible enough to figure out and keep an eye on and learn from the ones as they happen. That's what I do for a living, and also what I do to keep myself from bashing my head against the wall as everybody starts talking about the presidential election in 2018.
Which is another rant, but I've already given it.
Yeah. I'm sure you've given it about 5 times already.
Right. Well, and I do believe that hope is not irrational. I mean, one of the things that we come up against when we want to think or talk about hope is that we're told that by many of, in my case, by friends or people who are politically sympathetic to my own point of view. And by the way, I got the Antonio Gramsci reference in your last answer, but we're told by people, if you're optimistic, you're being Pollyannish. You don't realize how screwed we really are. And, I don't believe that. I'm glad you mentioned, for example, the teachers' strikes, because those began in what we're always told is like one of the reddest of red states, one of the most conservative. Electoral politics has got to be a right-wing Democrat like Joe Manchin, or it'll be no Democrat at all. And yet, spontaneously, from the bottom up, and then in Oklahoma, and then in Arizona, teachers organized. They defied every institutional force that was arrayed against them. They marched. They got support from friends, not all of them, but from many, many friends and neighbors who would bring out food and water. And, and the people I talked to who were participating in them in real time while they were going on were filled with that same electric enthusiasm that you were describing earlier. I mean, that one of my sources of optimism is the upwelling of people-directed, people-powered initiative that got some concrete results. So, I mean, we talk about occupied in the last, quote unquote, but it changed the conversation. It made the 99% and the 1% a part of the public mind. And I think every time people have their sense of the limits of the possible broken open, they remember that. There's a visceral memory that they carry forward to the next moment. Does that make sense to you?
Absolutely. I think that one of the things that I heard over and over when I was reporting my book was people saying that, like, once somebody sort of got arrested for the first time, or once somebody went out and did sort of a civil disobedience for the first time, once they sort of hit that limit that you're not supposed to cross, and they did it anyway, they were totally changed. And there's stories being told about that in this country. The people who are part of the protests against Brett Kavanaugh this year, which also didn't succeed, right? He's on the Supreme Court, God help us all. And yet you had people, mostly women, who went and told their stories and, sat in and disrupted the Senate. And they aren't going to forget that experience, and it's not going to stop them the next time. And it's, it wells up, and my friends and I used to talk about it being, there's 2 metaphors that I like. One is like a wave, and the wave comes in and then it goes back out, but it leaves little tide pools. And what happens in the tide pools while you're waiting for the next wave is what is going to shape the next thing. Or the other one that I like is blowing on a dandelion. And the seeds go everywhere, and you don't know where they go and where they land and where they sprout, but they do sprout. And then there's another dandelion, and then that one blows out. And so the way that these things spread, we can't always track. We can't always sort of organize them perfectly. But they do change the world. And whether they will change it enough, I don't know. I don't want to promise all your listeners that we're magically going to, act in the last 12 years, because if there's anything I've learned about the, global ruling class, is that they literally do not care about anyone other than themselves. And Elon Musk wants to build a spaceship to Mars so they can all go live there while we all die on Earth. But I do think that it is possible to understand that, that people will only take so much, and then they will stop behaving.
Yes, no, I think that's exactly right. And I guess what we've talked a lot about hope, and we've talked a lot about potential. I guess what I want to maybe take for the last stage of our conversation is, Where are you going to be looking, or do you know yet even? I mean, to me, one of the beautiful things about these uprisings, whether it's the teachers or Exhilaration, is the unexpectedness, the seeming randomness of them. But do you have anything, particular areas or movements or things or sectors or regions or whatever that you really are interested in keeping an eye on in 2019?
Oh yeah, well, I'm heading to Los Angeles, barring, like I said, a last minute deal to go cover the Los Angeles teachers strike that starts January 10th. So that's one. I'm working on a new book, so some of my direction this year is going to be shaped by what I'm reporting on for that book. But I have plans to go to London, where I'm really interested in some of the organizing that's been done among like Uber drivers, Deliveroo drivers, workers in the gig economy, who are doing really interesting organizing, using their platforms, using things like WhatsApp to have strikes and flying pickets and things that we haven't really seen erupt in quite that way in this country. What else? Oh, the government in England might fall at any moment too. So there's that. Brexit shambles, as we like to call it. What else? I am fascinated by the ongoing sort of power shifts and struggles in Europe. I am, on a more depressing note, probably going back to Indiana to talk to the folks who were at the Carrier plant that Trump supposedly saved and the Rexnord plant down the street that Trump definitely didn't save. And also want to make a trip to Ohio to the Lordstown plant, which is definitely not being saved by Trump. That is one of the many GM plants that they're shutting down. And to talk about what promises have been made repeatedly to the industrial working class in this country and the reality of that. So that's what's on my plate, but I'm trying to keep it flexible because, as we have said multiple times here, all sorts of things could pop up at any moment. And I think that's exciting. It's exhausting. I don't get a lot of sleep, but it does give me a reason to have some hope for the future.
And what do you see as the role of people like us in all this? I certainly have opinions on it, and I don't even know how to characterize us exactly. But people who write, speak, talk about this stuff, talk to others about this stuff in a journalistic capacity, but also have a vested interest in the outcome. I mean, how would you describe? There are more and more people like us. I don't know if you've noticed, but and they're really smart people like us coming, appearing all the time. So, what would you call people like us, and what would you see as our role in all of this?
Well, I call myself a journalist. I don't profess to speak for everybody else who does things that are vaguely like me. I run into academics doing academic research in the same places that I'm doing journalistic reporting. But the advice that I would have, since I'm full of Marxist aphorisms today, is I believe Amilcar Cabral's line to tell no lies and claim no easy victories. I think it is, while we've been talking about hope, and while I think that's really important, I also think it's important to be honest about what we see happening, where we see the challenges, where we see the flaws, where we see the negatives as well as the positives, where we see the struggles not working, because that's the only way that we figure out what works the next time. And do that in solidarity with the people you're covering, not to tear them down and prove how smart you are, but to, most of the time the criticisms that I hear of movements are the criticisms that I hear from the people in those movements. I'm not sort of coming in from the outside and going, I know what you're doing wrong, French protesters, or something like that. It's much more a question of like, so on the ground, what do people see as the problem? What do they think didn't work this time? What do they think did work next time, or will work next time? Those kinds of questions, I think it's really important to keep asking, because again, like, we should be clear that it's great that the left is doing better than it has in opinion polls and some elections in a very long time, but we're nowhere near where we need to be. Again, that ticking time bomb of climate change is really coming. And so to be honest about where we are, what's good, what's bad, where are the opportunities, and where are the challenges, I think is our job as broadly people who are get paid to write and say things about movements and politics.
Okay, well, that's a great summary, and I can't improve upon it. So we will leave it there. Sarah Jaffe's latest piece for the New York Times is The Exhilaration of Revolt. I encourage you to read it. Her first book is Necessary Trouble, Americans in Revolt. She has another one coming. She didn't. We don't know what it's about. And she is a Nation Institute fellow and an independent journalist. Sarah, as always, great to talk to you. Thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you.